Assad, that regime was very different because it was not just one-man rule. It was more like an oligarchy in the sense that you had the Ba'ath Party, which had been in power more or less for 50 years. They had offices in every town, every neighborhood, actively recruited people as members. They had a unifying ideology. The military, almost everybody had been in the military and had close, many of them had maybe close families, officers who benefited from the system. You had the sectarian divisions. You had large minorities, not just of Alawites, but of Christians, who are about 10% of the population, of Shias and Druze, who felt that Assad, as bad as he was at least protection from the more hardcore fundamentalist, extremist types that might come to power if the Sunni majority ever gained power. So you had this kind of divide and rule strategy. On top of that, there was the crony capitalist class that benefited from government support. Those are mostly Sunni business people. So if you take a decent percentage, though not all, of the religious minorities, combined with those that have close personal ties with the party and the military, and as well as the economic interest, you have a good 30–40% of the population. So whether your struggle is nonviolent or violent, if you're going against a regime that has a social base, even though it's a minority, if it's a big enough minority, it's going to be much harder than going against one-man rule. We saw this in the leftist revolutions, for example, that Somoza was pretty easy to overthrow in Nicaragua, whereas in El Salvador it was more of an oligarchical system. It became much more difficult. You also had the problem that civil society was weaker in Syria than it had been in Tunisia and in Egypt. He had been able to Assad had been able to manipulate the strong sense of nationalism that the people had that the Syrians have long had in the face of threats from the West, the Israeli occupation and the like. So basically, it was a real challenge. It was clear that Assad was not going to fall within a matter of weeks, as had been the case in the other Arab revolutions. But people were so angry, so frustrated at the massacres. Many people were saying we need to take up arms. And they pointed out how Libya had started out nonviolently. They took up arms, and then the West came to the rescue in terms of military intervention. Maybe they'll do that if we take up arms as well. Ended up being a disastrous decision. Because turning to armed struggle just gave the regime the excuse for even greater repression. The large-scale defections from the military and the police, which originally formed the basis of the so-called Free Syrian Army, largely stopped. Soldiers are much more likely to defect if they're being ordered to shoot into crowds of unarmed protesters than if they're being shot at themselves. And the big problem, of course, was that as the armed struggle continued, the hardline Islamist groups gained the ascendancy. The Free Syrian Army really wasn't much of an army. The Pentagon estimated that it was literally as many as 1,000 separate militia acting not in coordination with each other. They ranged in ideology, they ranged in their military preparedness, but they were weak from the very beginning. But the Islamists ended up dominating, and many of the FSA units got overrun by the Islamists, or in the course of the struggle they became radicalized. And I knew a number of stories of young fighters who started off as moderate and secular, but as the struggle continued, and out of their desperation and the horror that was around them, embraced this very, very reactionary, militaristic, chauvinistic version of Islam. Of course, we then came to the rise of ISIS. Now, bringing the war to the cities gave the regime the excuse to unleash extreme brutality, massive bombings of crowded civilian neighborhoods, Reputable human rights groups have investigated and documented crimes against humanity of an extraordinary degree. Thousands of civilians are being killed every month. During the nonviolent phase of the struggle, 5,000 civilians were killed, roughly. Since then, it is literally, the death toll has gone up 50 times. And nearly 250,000 people have died. At least 2/3 of them have, or 3/4 of them have been civilians. 7.5 million people, about a third of the country's population, have been displaced. 4 million of them are in exile as refugees. Though it's interesting, and I just want to mention, we've heard a lot of attention in Europe about a couple 100,000 refugees that have fled into Europe. But remember, the overwhelming majority of refugees are hosted by countries that are a lot poorer and a lot less capable of supporting them than the European ones. I want to talk a little bit about the rise of ISIS, since they're the ones that are kind of on people's minds. You know, they've ended up being even more ruthless and deadly than the government. Not in terms of the total numbers killed. That's primarily from the regime, because they have an air force and can drop bombs in crowded areas. But we've all heard the stories, the ruthless control of ISIS, the beheadings, the executions, mass kidnappings and rapes, and the like. You know, there are times, you know, when the United States has exaggerated stories of various you know, terrorist groups, guerrilla groups we don't like, but from everything I'm aware of, the horror of ISIS is not exaggerated. This is a fanatical cult. Has about as much to do with Islam as the you know, Branch Davidians or the neo-Nazi Christian identity groups have with Christianity. You know, if you look at the original caliphates, you know, the original caliphates that they were claiming to be emulating actually gave autonomy and rights for the Jewish and Christian minorities, including their own court systems. They respected the archaeological treasures of pre-Islamic times. These certainly weren't democracies by 20th century Western standards, but they were nothing like the horror that's being inflicted in the name of Islam, you know, by this group of fanatics. But I want to tell a little bit about how they emerged. Their leadership is largely Iraqi. Many military commanders are actually members of the Iraqi army who suddenly found themselves unemployed when the United States invaded the country. And instead of just purging the top officers, you know, loyal to Saddam, they ended up eliminating the entire armed forces. So you had these embittered, unemployed men who were able to take home their guns and military training and become guerrilla fighters. The other problem was that the other bastion of secular nationalism in Iraq the United States got rid of was the civil service. You know, basically, we said any member of the Ba'athist Party can no longer be a member of government. But since you had to be a member of the Ba'athist Party to work in the civil service, that pretty much eliminated everybody. And they became personal fiefdoms of these Shiite sectarian parties that ended up, you know, dominating Iraq after the U.S. invasion. And the new Iraqi army was organized primarily by the Badr Corps, which was the armed wing of the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, a pro-Iranian group. In fact, the Badr Corps had actually been armed and trained by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. They fought on Iran's side on the Iran-Iraq War. So to many Iraqis, particularly the Sunnis, who are strongest in terms of the sense of Arab nationalism, they saw their government being taken over by these pro-Persian, pro-Iranian factions, you know, that had killed their fellow Iraqis in this long, bloody war in the 1980s, that they got in power by virtue of an invasion by traditional imperialist powers, the United States and Britain, that they'd also opposed. Their historic enemies had kind of taken over. And who made that possible? It was the Iraqi Shias, who are just as Arab as they were, who were their neighbors. And there'd been intermarriage between the Sunnis and Shias in small towns, only one mosque, Sunnis and Shias worship together. I mean, theologically, there's less difference between Sunnis and Shias than there are between Catholics and Protestants. And they had not been fighting each other for years. I mean, Saddam Hussein was ruthless against Shia groups that kind of organized as Shia groups. But if you look at the ruling Ba'ath Party, at least a third of the top leaders were Shia. It was a secular nationalist regime. What I'm saying is that the sectarian fighting that helped greatly give rise to ISIS was not something that grew spontaneously out of, oh, they've been fighting each other for centuries, but it was a direct consequence of the U.S. invasion and post-occupation U.S. policies. Now, one of the groups that had been fighting the United States and the government, there were like 40 armed groups fighting U.S. troops after the invasion, but one of it was a minority, one of the deadliest and most dangerous was the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which had sprung up in the Sunni-dominated areas. But many of the Sunni tribesmen who had been fighting the U.S. and the Iraqi government said, you know, these Al-Qaeda guys are even scarier. If the Maliki government, the U.S.-backed an Iranian-backed Shia government, would incorporate Sunnis back into the army, back into the government, we will join your side in fighting Al-Qaeda. And they did. And Al-Qaeda was largely defeated. In fact, it was this agreement, much more than the so-called surge, which led to a lessening of the fighting. But the Maliki government didn't go through their end of the deal, and the sectarian tensions remained. And again, they're not fighting each other for theological reasons. If you think, for example, when speaking of Catholics and Protestants, think of Northern Ireland. Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland were not killing each other for their religious differences per se, but because of various historic reasons. The Protestants identified with Britain, and the Catholics with the Irish Republic. It was competing nationalisms, and there was sort of an assumption if you were Protestant, you sided with Britain; if you were Catholic, you sided with Ireland. And so when the IRA or the Ulster Unionists would plant bombs in the other people's pubs, you know, killing random civilians, and the tit-for-tat killings that went on, you know, for several decades. Again, it was about how the religion became fused with the national identity in this nationalist struggle. Similarly, the fighting in Iraq initially was about the sense by some Sunnis that the Shias were collectively responsible for, you know, for taking Iraq out of the Arab orbit and into that of the Western powers and of Iran. But whatever the reasons, it more and more evolved into one that was more sectarian. Suddenly, who you were did make a difference. And there was mutual ethnic cleansing, or religious cleansing, if you will. And in recent years, the Sunnis started using nonviolent protests and tent cities and other kinds of efforts to try civil resistance to try to get the Maliki government to fulfill its end of the bargain. They responded by brutal repression, including massacres. And so when this new shadowy group, ISIS, emerged out of the remnants of the old Al-Qaeda in Iraq, they were actually welcomed by the Sunni communities, saying, how could they be worse than the Iraqi government? Well, they were. And the Iraqi government didn't, the army was so corrupt and everything, they just threw down their weapons, and ISIS picked them up along with banks, you know, full of gold, along with all sorts of other oil and other resources. And this enabled them to increase, to move into Syria with more arms, more money, and take over large swaths of territory in that country as well. Of course, they don't recognize Iraq and Syria. That's why they use terms like the Levant or others, in the sense that they see these boundaries as, again, artificial colonial constructs that they don't recognize. So basically what I'm saying is that yes, the horrific repression of the Assad regime, the evaporation of the nonviolent struggle, you know, was a major cause of the rise of ISIS or ISIL or the Islamic State, whatever you want to call it. But a lot of the blame, frankly, goes to the United States for our intervention in Iraq. If it had not been for the invasion of Iraq, there would be no ISIS. I mean, some conspiracy theorists say we somehow created ISIS or we're secretly arming ISIS. No, we're very disturbed at the rise of ISIS. But it was a direct consequences, again, I would argue, of the U.S. intervention. Indeed, if you look at ISIS's military equipment, and this has led to some of the conspiracy theories, but you will notice that the vast majority is U.S. made. Now, the U.S. did not arm ISIS directly with this, but they were able to capture it from the Iraqi army, capture it from rival rebel groups in Syria, some of which were armed by the United States and others armed through U.S. allies in the Persian Gulf, like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who get their arms from the U.S. But it's contributed to the horror that we're seeing unfold in that country. And it's led to a lot of difficult questions. So what can we do now? Well, it's interesting because during the fall semester 2 years ago, I was having to explain to my students why the United States appeared to be on the verge of going to war against the Syrian government. And then last fall, I was having to explain to my students why the United States was going to war against Syrian rebels. Initially, the big concern, of course, was the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime, a horrific attack which killed over 1,000 innocent civilians. But the direct confrontation was averted when Russia was able to negotiate Syria's delayed entry into the chemical weapons treaty and disarm them, even though other forms of mass killings, unfortunately, by the regime have continued. Now we have ISIS as seen as the bigger threat, and the U.S. has begun airstrikes against ISIS, along with Britain, France, the Jordanians, Saudis, and more recently Russia. The latter is of concern to the United States because Russia appears not to be bombing just ISIS, but also some of the more moderate groups that the U.S. supports. Russia's agenda seems to be more at propping up Assad. Where the United States would like to see Assad go, but also, of course, would like to see ISIS suppressed. In many ways, let me just mention a bit on the Russian perspective. I mean, to the Russians, the Middle East is like Latin America is to us. And for those of you who remember the Cold War, remember how the United States was quite willing to support all sorts of thugs and dictators and rationalize for war crimes in the name of fighting what we call terrorists, that was leftist rebels. And Russia is engaging in a similar kind of policy, only the difference being that usually in Latin America, the case of the Soviet penetration was greatly exaggerated, whereas in the case of the Middle East, the United States really is become the hegemonic power with the U.S. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and military bases all throughout the area, and a number of regimes that were once pro-Russian, having been overthrown and taken a more pro-Western orientation. So the Russians have their strategic rationale for that, but I would argue that there's absolutely no justification for this kind of intervention, especially anything that supports Assad. Well, does any kind of military intervention make sense, given what's there? And I have a hard time with this question in a lot of ways, because I feel like if policymakers had listened to me, we wouldn't be in this mess. So now they turn to me and say, okay, what do we do now? And I'm personally skeptical about military intervention. My own background, I grew up in a Christian pacifist family, and so the idea of endorsing any kind of military intervention, even on humanitarian grounds, is a tough one to me. At the same time, we are faced with this unprecedented threat in terms of ISIS. Again, and not to mention, people can certainly make a case in terms of a no-fly zone or some kind of responsibility to protect vis-a-vis the terror and repression by Assad. At the same time, I'm open to being convinced that some kind of targeted military intervention is worthwhile, is morally and legally defensible. But I'm still not convinced yet. I do this for a couple of reasons. First of all, the United States has been bombing that part of the world on and off for a good quarter century now, and we seem to have only made things worse. Secondly, the fact is that most of the fighting is taking place in crowded urban areas. Killings of civilians is inevitable in these cases. And even though Assad and ISIS are responsible for far more civilian deaths overall, when the U.S. does end up killing civilians, and we have by the hundreds in our strikes in Syria over the past year or so, it plays right into the hands of both the regime and of ISIS, that here are these Western imperialist powers once again coming in and intervening and killing our people. And they have reminders of this. If you drive through Syria, you'll see the remnants of Crusader castles. You know, these people have a long memory of Western imperialism, you know, going back more than a millennium. And you know, they're in many ways, this kind of, it's just, in other words, whatever tactical advantages militarily that foreign intervention by the United States or Russia or anybody else, you know, might have, it could lead in the longer term to strategic losses, you know, politically, as people rally around the flag in terms of Assad or in terms of the black flag of ISIS, that both have been able to cynically manipulate the strong sense of nationalism, you know, the history of resistance against colonialism, against Western invasions and intervention that's gone on in Syria and elsewhere in that part of the world for such a long time. I mean, I think the only way that air power really could make a difference would be if ISIS was being challenged, you know, by a unified popular movement, not the corrupt armed and brutal armed forces of Iraq or Syria. I think in fact, one area where the U.S. bombing has helped has been in the Kurdish areas of Syria, where the YPG, the armed Kurdish movement there, which has a lot of popular grassroots support, has women fighters, you know, has a kind of a decentralized kind of socialist organization. You know, they have been quite effective in fighting against ISIS. And again, military planners will tell you no matter how many bombs you drop, if you're going to win a battle, you have to have somebody there on the ground with the flag, you know, claiming that space. So you need to have people on the ground who can do it. But the Kurds, remember, are a minority. They're only 10% of the Syrian population. If ISIS is going to be defeated, it needs to be defeated, you know, by you know, presumably Sunni Arab Syrians. And at this point, there really is not a force that is mobilized that air power can really really support. So, I mean, there's something about, I think we may have to just wait. And that's a hard thing to say. I mean, there's something about the American persona that, you know, if we drop enough bombs, if we send enough money, if we do enough this or enough that, we can fix things. But there are limits, you know, to what any outside power can do at this point. And as frustrating as that might be. And again, we don't have a good history in that part of the world. And so, you know, oftentimes, you know, even well-intended and even you know, for a good cause, U.S. intervention, especially the military kind, you know, can inadvertently backfire. But a couple of things to give you a little, there are a few glimmers of hope I want to mention. One is that groups so extreme, so rigid, so ideological as ISIS can't govern in the long term. They control millions of people over wide swaths of territory. They need to keep water and electricity running. From what I can hear, they're doing a pretty bad job. More and more people are fleeing the area, not just to flee the repression, but just because things aren't working, things aren't functioning. And people are saying no in a lot of ways. I mean, remember, nonviolent resistance is not just people being out on the streets protesting. And in Syria, that can get you killed pretty quickly, as folks found out. But there are other ways of more quiet resistance, more individual resistance that can still undermine the system. And that is the fact that 90% of families, Syrian families under the control of ISIS, are not sending their kids to ISIS schools. That they do not want to be indoctrinated in this gross distortion of Islam. You know, there are other tiny acts of non-cooperation that are going on all the time. And cumulatively, that could help lead to their eventual collapse. I think that what things outside powers can do to perhaps hasten that, would be to go after the black market, especially on the Turkish border. We do have some sway in Turkey in terms of our aid, in terms of our military bases and the like. We could really press, to make it more and more difficult for ISIS to get its funding. We need to pressure our allies in Turkey and in the Gulf region to stop supporting some of the non-ISIS hardline Islamists, because often they end up working in along with ISIS on some areas. But I think, and we also need to push for diplomacy, even with people we don't like Assad, like the Russians, like the Iranians, to try to reach some kind of settlement. But there can be the only settlement that can be reached that will last, to have any hope, would be one that includes Syrian civil society, because they're the ones that started the struggle. These are the people who want a more democratic, inclusive Syria. They don't want Assad or ISIS. We need to do what we can to strengthen civil society. Try to get a ceasefire so people can get out of their homes, some people can return, and can start that slow process of rebuilding the popular movement that once looked so promising at making Syria a better place. Indeed, statistically, we found that nonviolent movements against dictatorships are more than twice as likely to succeed as armed struggles against dictatorships. They are more likely to succeed in a shorter time, with fewer casualties, and far more likely to have a democratic opening, or have a democratic outcome after a number of years. Again, even against brutal dictators. We remember nonviolent resistance that brought down, it wasn't NATO that brought down the communist regimes of Eastern Europe. It was Polish dock workers, Czech intellectuals, East German church people, Estonian folk singers. It wasn't the New People's Army that brought down Marcos, the US-backed dictator in the Philippines. It was nuns praying the rosary in front of the tanks and millions of others. It wasn't 11 weeks of NATO bombing that brought down Milosevic, the butcher of the Balkans in Serbia. It was young students organizing the people to rise up against a stolen election. It was not the armed wing of the ANC that brought majority rule to South Africa. It was massive civil resistance in the townships and through a revitalized labor movement combined with international sanctions made possible by nonviolent resistance in Western countries. We've seen brutal dictators from Indonesia. Suharto had more blood in his hands than Saddam Hussein. Pinochet in Chile. Even in countries like in African countries, like Mali and Benin. In fact, just last year in Burkina Faso, in fact, when they staged a coup, the people rose up again, and the coup only lasted a week. We've seen these kinds of movements against brutal regimes, with thousands of people die, still able to mobilize, and I still think that is a possibility. But the killing has to stop before we can see this, because the fact is the people of Syria, like people elsewhere in the region, really do desire democracy. We need to get away from the stereotype that somehow Arabs and Muslims are not ready for democracy or whatever, because I've spent enough time in that part of the world to know that Arabs and Muslims don't like to be jailed, tortured, and killed for their political beliefs any more than Western Christians do. The form a democracy may take can vary depending on a country's unique history and culture, but that desire for transparency in government, that desire for accountability, the desire for political freedom and social justice, that really is universal. And we need to encourage that impulse, that people like that take the lead in the future of Syria, not just the people with guns.